Hi everyone, my name is Julia and this is the Biracial Project. Our series right now is on Asian Americans, and joining me for our conversation today is my friend Cathy Jackson. Hey Cathy, how are you doing?
Hi, Julie. I'm doing well. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for joining our conversation today.
Thank you for having me.
hmm So I kind of wanted to start out with asking you what you do for a living.
Yeah, so I'm kind of right now, I'm an accidental work from home mom, I guess. I used to work in higher education, and then I transitioned to the nonprofit sector, and from there got involved in some anti-racism training, and then met my husband, got married, continued working, and then after having my son, it was kind of hard to keep working, so now I'm ultra part-time.
Okay, awesome. How old is your son?
Blake is 18 months. He'll be 19 months in a few days. Yeah, he's a fun kid. He's like to chew on mulch and
Oh man.
run around. Yeah.
Okay, nice. So I want to also start out kind of just getting to know you a little bit more. What is your ethnicity?
So my mom is full Filipino, and then my dad is German and Irish, kind of a little bit of both, lickey split. And they both actually spent time abroad. He was mostly from being in the military. His dad was in the military, so he lived in Panama and then also Germany and the US growing up. And then my mom came when she was 5. So she came from the Philippines with grandparents at the age of 5.
How would you describe your experience growing up biracial?
So I would describe it as really a lot of opposites. So culturally, it was a lot of fun. Filipinos are a very warm culture, so it's always person first. It's never, no one's ever late, really. If someone is 2 hours late to a party, that's normal. You have a barbecue and you cook enough for, maybe an extra 50 people because people will just show up because if there's one more person, that's a good thing. So it's very much just people our priority. Time is not an issue. And then my dad's side is more German. They usually tend to be more organized. My dad's very reserved. He'll go very deep, but he's not like a small talker. Like my mom will just hug you, things like that. So growing up, I would say in my personality, I identified more with my mom's culture. But my dad's extended family is also very warm just from having lived a lot of places. I think my dad just absorbed more German culture from living there during grade school years. He was in the German school system, so he has more of that mannerism to him.
They seem to be very different cultures. So that's an interesting dynamic in the home. How would you say race was talked about in your home growing up?
So there was definitely a love of culture. We loved traveling. We would travel out since my dad worked for Delta, travel a lot just domestically or overseas. We really loved just food from everywhere. We had a lot of friends from different countries, a lot of family from different countries, so we could really see more of like a global picture of the world. In terms of like race and racism, it was something that was hard because we basically moved from Chicago, which is very diverse, when I was about to enter grade school. And then we moved to the South Side because it was affordable, low taxes, but literally everyone was white. Like people would point and stare at us. Always like mouths open. Like we were so weird. People would see us, not to mention there were 10 of us and we were driving around in a bus, like
Yeah.
a bus. It's not something you see every day. So when we tell our mom, she would just be like, oh, like, well, don't think about that. That's not, she had a hard time, I think, going there. Like if we would have things that happened or like at the mall, like this little kid like pointed us and was like, the mom was ashamed because of what he said. He made like a statement about us and she like shushed him and hid him away. And I don't now that I'm a mom, I guess I think my mom maybe was not so much avoiding it as just it wasn't like top of mind for her. It was more like I'm going to get my 10 kids home and eat lunch. It wasn't like she was avoiding it. It was just I think she was busy and hadn't really processed it to where she wanted to pause and like, hey, let's like really unpack this.
Okay. Yeah. So when you say you guys moved to the South Side, you're talking about South Side of Indianapolis or in
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Cedar Grove kind of, yeah, I would say Center Grove area.
Uh-huh. And what is the demographic there?
Yeah. So when we moved, it was like at least 90, 95% completely white, a little bit of mixed, very few Black or Asians at the time.
Okay. So can you talk a little bit about how Filipino culture could be different than other Southeast Asian cultures?
Yeah, Filipino culture is really interesting in that it was very influenced by the Spanish occupation. So, Spanish colonial rule was about 400 years in the Philippines, and the Philippines actually only really got independence after World War II. They were briefly controlled by the US during World War II. So, they had always been fighting for independence. But in terms of culture, there was such a long occupation with the Spaniards that even the language is very close to Spanish. So it's very similar to Latin culture, in words, in food. Like we make flan, it's called leche flan for dessert, but it's very similar to what you would have in Spain.
That's interesting. So you said growing up, you kind of identified more with your mom's culture, which is an Asian culture. How is it when you meet other people from Southeast Asia who could be from a different country? And in the eyes of majority culture, they might look at both of you guys and be like, "Oh, you're from the same part of the world," or "Wow, you guys are both Asian, so you must be very similar to each other." Would you say there are similarities?
Yeah, in terms of Southeast Asian culture, I would say it's really easy to connect for me with Southeast Asians. Like I had some friends that were also biracial, but they were from, I'm trying to think, I think it was Malaysia, and just there was basically like the family comes first, focus on food, a lot of focus on faith. There's a ton of similarities, I would say, but if you're looking at like contrast, a bigger contrast would be like maybe Japanese or Chinese culture. Cultures that are more nuanced, I would say,
Mhm.
would have a larger contrast. And also, the Filipinos do focus on academics, depending on where you are in the Philippines, but it's not always fitting some of the stereotypes because it's an island. And so there's a lot of more of like an island culture, a little more laid back.
Okay, yeah. So speaking of stereotypes, what would you say are some common Asian stereotypes? Let's see, how did I word this question exactly? Sometimes I forget what I even wrote down. Oh, okay. So what are some Asian stereotypes you heard and like saw growing up, and how did those influence your racial identity?
Yeah, I think the biggest stereotypes that are completely wrong usually media portrayals. Like you always see there's like the tiger mom who her kid has to get the A, and it's like I don't know. I feel like that's just the biggest narrative that you see a lot, and it aims to be quote diverse, but it like lumps all these Asians together. And then on top of that, for example, my mom is the Asian, my dad is more white. So physically, I present, a lot of people would say more as like Latina, sometimes Indian. So people, even in their stereotypes, can be so wrong based on how this person is presenting. So yeah, the stereotypes can be so confusing, especially if you add now there's a lot more people like me who are multiracial. That stereotype can be completely wrong, and it can be harmful, which I could talk more about. But it can be really harmful because it basically lumps this entire group of people that have so much variety, not only in appearance, but also where they come from, what their culture's like. It lumps everyone together in this stereotype that can also be used against Black friends and against other groups to basically create divisions where there don't need to be.
That's so interesting. So can you talk a little more about that, how it can actually cause division?
Yeah, so a lot of people, like when they think about protests or they think about like Malcolm X, they would not remember that there were actually other peoples of color that actually stood with Malcolm X. For example, there was one woman, her name was Yuri Koshiyama, and she was with Malcolm X throughout his life, and they were close allies. But when Asians are part of this model minority, basically the model minority was perpetuated to have Asians feel like, okay, you are law abiding, you are smart, you have wealth, and so therefore you're going to be treated, basically you're not white, but you're in the middle, and you're going to be in this upper echelon where in this category of race, we're going to allow you to be in the middle. But if you're going to be in the middle, you can't identify with other people that are oppressed. You can't protest. We're going to silence you, because if you're going to be above, you can't have solidarity. You can't be with other groups, even that completely ignores the Chinese Exclusion Act. It completely ignores Japanese internment. And it's basically saying, we're going to ignore all these ways you've been discriminated against in the immigration system for centuries, just to allow you this one little piece of privilege. And you have to accept that.
Interesting. Yeah, so this concept of model minority, like I mentioned, is kind of new to me. When I was reading about the Asian American experience, that term kept coming up. So when I did a little more research, to me, it seemed like a status that often Asian Americans will be categorized as, and it says that like you guys are doing well, you guys are doing what minorities should do, and therefore the government doesn't really need to help you guys out that much because you guys are just using the resources that are already there. Is that kind of what a model minority is?
Well, it's interesting about perceptions versus like the lived experience. So, like one example I could think of is my brother got into dental school, and he had like, I mean, his GPA could not have been higher. He was president of all these organizations. When he got into dental school, one of my sisters, who was at a white Christian school, her friend said, "Well, my brother didn't get in. He's white." And my sister was Sarah. I was like, "Well, what do you mean by that?" And she's like, "He's white, so he didn't get in." And she said, Sarah was like, "Well, what was his GPA? What groups was he in?" And it quickly became apparent there was no favoritism. It was just my brother really basically killed himself to get into this school. And to say, "Well, you're Asian, you got in because of this." That's usually a perception of like, you're Asian, you're smart, but at the same time, it can be viewed negatively, I think, by white peers or even by Black peers, because it's like you're perceived as being something and you're getting this status maybe that sets you apart, but we're actually, usually you don't actually benefit from it. It's
Okay.
it's kind of double-edged, I guess.
Yeah.
The
So you're
concept.
Yeah, so you're saying it can actually sometimes work against people or create a negative perception from majority culture and saying, oh, because you're Asian, you were able to get in, or maybe they're looking to diversify the dental class, and so they might select some individuals over others. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah, there can be that perception.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
It kind of goes with, I think, in terms of like the concept of tokenism, which is like, it's like this bad, the goal is diversity, in a lot of institutions now, and a lot of just areas that everybody wants to seem inclusive, they want to seem diverse. And so they'll tokenize not only Asians, but, all people of color to try to really show how diverse they are, when in reality, it's just, you're being tokenized to look a certain way.
That's so interesting. So a lot of African Americans would say that currently it's not really an equal playing field when it comes to opportunities. How does the Asian American culture feel about the equal playing field and if they have the same opportunities as majority culture?
Yeah, so it's super interesting. I guess like I would speak from my own experience of being, one boss said, racially ambiguous, because it was like, "Hey, you check all the boxes." Cool. And ironically, I did, because I was working with youth, and like all like youth of color were like, "You look like me," like, because like I could look like a different person based on the season, because sometimes I'm tan, sometimes I'm not, anyway. But so the question was, you were asking, how do Asians feel about, sorry, can you say that again?
So I would say a lot of African Americans right now, like the reason, I think one of the main reasons why there's been a lot of unrest right now is not only because of police brutality, but also just bringing to light the fact that opportunities for people of color are not equal with opportunities of majority culture individuals. And I would say that's a very true and common perception that's held, or not perception, but a belief that's held in the African American community. So my question is kind of, how does the Asian American community feel about that? Do they also feel like it's currently not really an equal playing field when it comes to opportunities?
So it depends really who you ask. So like if you ask my Lulu, he would say, I faced discrimination. Like he couldn't get an apartment when he came here because no one wanted to rent to somebody who wasn't white. So he would say, "I just always was better." And that was what he told his kids. So like, you always have to be better. It doesn't matter. You have to be the best. If there's 10 people, you have to be number one. So a lot of Asians, especially Asian immigrants, felt the pressure so strongly that they will be very competitive and just be like, "I'm going to do something that's guaranteed. If I have the credentials, like if I'm a doctor, I will have a job. And they lean more towards those fields. Like, just in my own personal experience and in my family, it was like, well, the medical field, you will have a job, you will have the stability and the opportunity, strive for that. And there was kind of some discouragement from a lot of my family on my mom's side to go into anything like, liberal arts, humanities, just because it can be ambiguous and there are ways that you might not have those same opportunities as
Hmm.
peers. Yeah, but
Interesting.
in terms, yeah, and I think what you're talking about, like there not being space, or there being like, it's like, okay, so you have an organization and you want to have one person of color at the top, right? Maybe they want to hire a Black person or an Asian person. It's like you only can have a few people, right, of color, because there's this fear of we don't want to look racist, but at the same time we want to maintain this corporate culture that we have. And so therefore it creates these limited opportunities for people of color. And then it kind of pits people against each other. I've seen that happen. And it's just, I think it isn't fair, and it's really sad. And I think it's where, for people of color, we have to band together or create our own opportunities. If it's like, hey, there's 2 seats at this table of 20, well, then we probably need our own table at that point.
Yes. I think that's so important to say and to acknowledge because for the majority culture, they don't see that. I don't believe that they see that. And I think the only way they can understand or realize that that stuff is happening is through stories of people of color and multiple stories and multiple accounts testifying to that reality.
Yeah, it's so painful. There was a friend actually did like a nonprofit racism, like what was it? It was like a Google survey they sent out, and you were like, you could disclose like the organizations you'd been in and like what the culture was like. But it can be so bad. And you're like, I talked to people that had left the organization way before I was there, or like looked at their experiences that have been written down, and the same experiences they had with like microaggressions that are really just aggressions and other things like 10 years later I was experiencing. And you just know this is not going to change. You can do all the workshops you want, but if management doesn't truly want to change, or there aren't going to be people of color truly in leadership, there's not change.
So going back to the biracial experience in that space, especially like in the workspace, trying to diversify an office or to bring to light the unequal playing field that exists. I'm wondering what that was like for you because it seems like you've always identified as at least part Asian, but understanding that your dad's side of your ethnicity is also very much a part of who you are. As a biracial woman, what was that like being in the workspace, trying to bring to light? I think it would be helpful to hear your thoughts, like having both narratives at the same time and also being a voice in that space to bring to light what's happening in workplaces across America.
Yeah, it's really interesting because when you are biracial or not like 100% one race, you can kind of feel like I've known a lot of friends or read that it can be described as like you're like on the fence, like you're half this, you're half that. So like you can understand both perspectives fully and kind of hold them, but also there's like, it's like you're holding multiple identities at all times. And sometimes I can feel fully one, like depending what space I'm in, or I can feel 100%, well, like 90% the other. But then when you're in a workspace, so for example, like if I'm working in like a focus group and it's all white but me, I can totally roll with that. That's fine. But then there'll come up issues where I'm wanting to represent the other perspective, and that comes out. So you can feel like almost like a traitor, I guess. Like you could choose to be like, in my way of working, I could choose to be very white and just be complete structure, really prioritizing certain things, or I could be more on the colorful side, where it's like everybody's voice is heard. We're focusing on the end goal. It's not about punctuality. It's not about this or that. It's not about ego. It's more the collective. Yeah. So it sometimes can be just really hard. I think I have never, other than for 1 year, worked in an organization led by a person of color. I would love to do that just because the dynamic is so different. The culture is so different. And I think if I were to formally like re-enter the nonprofit or for-profit world, I would want to work for an organization led by someone of color.
Yeah, how cool would that be? I feel like Even in the educational space, any classroom I've been in that the professor was a person of color, the experience was so different than when it was a majority culture slash majority race individual. So do you think that over time your racial identity has developed, or you may relate to a different side of your ethnicity than you used to?
Yeah, definitely. So I was thinking about like over like some key points in my life, and one would be when I like so okay like 1993 or 94 when I was shopping for a doll with my mom for my birthday. Like we were at Toys R Us. There was not a single Asian doll. No Asian, no biracial. There was
Wow.
like white, blonde, blue eyes, or there was the African American doll that was black and beautiful. But I was like, Mom, I want a doll that looks like me. And she was like, well, you're not gonna find one. Why don't you just good luck. And I just remember being so sad. But now, like, there's a friend I have who's in England and she's developing like dolls with disabilities that are biracial because her daughters have disabilities and is biracial. And I'm like, man, I wish I had lived in that world. But or Vogue. I was obsessed with Vogue. So like another key point, like say age 15, I didn't realize that I had an eating disorder, but I wanted to be thin and I got colored contacts that were like green and blue and I wore those. I highlighted my hair super light and like I wanted to be this Western picture of beauty. And that carried through college, like of just feeling like I had to wear a lot of makeup and I had to look this certain way and have certain guys dating me or I had to meet these certain like always it was always like this like standard. But when you think about it, like when I accepted that global part of myself and really identified with my aunts and with my Filipino heritage, I was able to just get rid of all those weird things. Or even there's colorism, like right in the Filipino community, like in the Philippines, skin whitening products are really popular. And some aunties from the Philippines were against being like tan. So they would be like, why are you so tan? And I remember as a kid, my mom was like, no, that's good. You be tan. And that was a part of myself. I think I had to let go of this Western concept of who I should be, that I should be thin, that I should be successful, that I should be basically be white, which I had never been. But I had to let that go. And now I am so much more accepting of not only myself, but the people around me. Like I don't feel this need to quantify everything, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think that's a common experience for not only biracial people, but any person of color growing up in yeah, growing up in a majority culture where the beauty standard is white, straight hair, thin, those characteristics of an individual, and then trying to cope with that and figuring out what your body type is and what your hair texture is and your physical appearance and how that's perceived by the public. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, what would you say to your 8-year-old self about growing up biracial, or like what advice as an adult now would you give to your childhood self?
Yeah, I would say just paint your own doll. You don't have to settle for a doll that looks nothing like you. I think if I could tell myself one thing, I would really listen to really my aunties on both sides who were like just so confident. And I remember one time there was something I was ashamed of for being Filipino, and my tita, my aunt was like, "Why would you ever be ashamed of being Filipino?" And like I think it was something about one of the foods or something I didn't like. It was like the smell was strong or something. But I would just tell myself to who cares? Like, who cares what your friends think about food or about whatever? Like, just embrace this culture that is so unique that you have.
That's awesome. Um, what will you be teaching your kids about Filipino culture?
Well, I'm hoping to bring Blake back to the Philippines when he's a little older. He's kind of young. It's like a 20 plus hour travel. But I really want him to understand the cultural values of like putting the family first versus just that hyper like individualism. I really want him to know the respect for the elders. Like in Filipino culture, in the Philippines, you would like when you greet anyone in a group, you would greet the eldest first. So like you would greet the Lulu, the grandfather, and then he would actually give like a blessing, like they'll do a kiss on the hand. And that way you're acknowledging the senior members of the family instead of like they're forgotten in their wheelchair, right? Like in a corner, you'd go to them first. And I remember explaining that to my husband when we got married, like this is a sign of respect. So I really want Blake to understand that in Filipino culture and a lot of Asian culture too, like you respect and treat the elders with reverence because of all that they've lived. That's something I love about the culture. I think I've really come to appreciate how many resources there are now that there weren't maybe 10 years ago, and how much organizing. I mean, there's been so much work done by young people, even in this city, to really bring about change. So I would just say it's worth it to get involved and to do the reading and self work.
Hmm. I think that there's a lot of people in the faith-based community who are kind of afraid of embracing racial diversity or racial reconciliation. What are what words would you speak to those individuals?
I would say, well, the facts don't lie. So, like, a lot of people have not heard, they would hear maybe it would be described as the Tulsa race riot with Black Wall Street, where it was really a massacre. Over 300 people died because of a pathetic rumor that a white person started, and 300 plus Black people were killed. So, I would say just do the research. I mean, if you look at, one of my mentors said, look at the first eyewitness accounts, look at the colonies in Jamestown, look at how the laws evolved, for example, with when slavery was legal. Look at how, instead of being where you obtained your race from your father previously, suddenly it became where you obtained your race from your mother. So if you were born a slave and the slave master was your dad, you could no longer be his race. So, like, if you look at the laws and you look at those firsthand accounts, it's undeniable. And there are so many Christians that I know that are starting to condemn, quote, what is it called? Critical race theory. So they're saying, well, there's no, yeah, that's not Christian. It's anti-American. I mean, Trump is on the bandwagon. Clearly, you cannot deny the facts of what happened. You cannot deny the facts of how race was created by anthropologists for the purpose of white supremacy. And I just really want people to really do their research, because once your eyes have been opened, you can't close them again.
What I'm hearing is that each individual should go do the research, kind of understand what has happened and what is happening now, and come to their own terms as to whether or not this is right or wrong, or really understanding like the morality of it, kind of.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Like, I think a lot of people are afraid that they don't have the facts and they just get swayed by popular opinion. But yeah, when you look at the facts of, like, even within our lifetime, of if you look at redlining and how the suburbs were created and how that impacts schools and like school to prison pipeline, like the evidence is everywhere. Like, it's all around us. But unless I wanted the answers personally myself quickly, but it took like years to really understand like the timeline of how we got to where we are, like as a society, in terms of the class system, the wealth system, and everything. Like, it'll take time and it takes digging.
For sure. Thanks for bringing that to light and challenging viewers of this video to go out and look at research, and also encouraging the biracial community to find communities that are out there, especially individuals who might be isolated or living in majority culture and not realizing that there are other people out there like them. Well, we're going to wrap up our conversation, but thanks, Cathy. I appreciate your time, and your perspective has really been helpful.
Thank you.